Welcome to Chapter 4, Planning Projects. Now this is Chapter 4 Planning Projects Part 1, but this is actually the video of the second half of that chapter. Here are our learning objectives. And today we'll cover Don't forget to download the presentation notes, the bare bones outline, so you can actually follow along and fill in the blanks.
Well, welcome to our whiteboard session today on planning a project in 5 steps. We get so many questions on planning projects and how to get beyond analysis paralysis and how to just alleviate skipping and going directly to executing the project. So today what we want to talk about there are some simple things that you can do to get out of analysis paralysis and begin planning to go towards execution. So I like to boil things down and make things simple, and I love a picture. A picture to me is worth 1,000 words. So in essence, we're trying to determine how do we get from point A to point B in a project. Point A being going from the beginning of the project with your scope and objectives to the end objective of the project, because as you know, a project has an objective. We're doing this project for some objective. And so if we work in planning, we come up with a course of action to get from point A to point B. So the assumption here is that the initiating has already started. So you are working with an authorized project charter that authorizes the project manager to even begin working on this. A lot of times we get ahead of ourselves in our projects and we can begin working on that. So the assumption here is we have the authorization to begin the planning for this project, and we do have a project charter which includes like a high-level budget, high-level scope, timeline, and resources for this project. So now the project manager is tasked with planning this. So here are 5 steps that can help you move forward. So basically we talk about creating the project plan. The project plan is to boil down in the different areas what has to be done, how are we going to do it, who is going to be doing it. So we're laying out processes so that the whole team, the whole project stakeholders, change control board, everyone knows how we're going to deliver this project. So again, you've heard us talk about on several of our whiteboard sessions mobilizing quickly, because when we talk with organizations and executives or shareholders of these projects, they're looking for things to be done in a synchronized way and things to be done quickly. So we talk about mobilizing with templates, anything that you can do to put in place, hopefully prior to the planning, but for sure in planning, you want to get there quickly. So get your templates in place and begin working on your project plan so you're not starting from scratch. Number 2, break down your deliverables. So in the project charter, you've given some type of scope or again the objective that you're trying to meet. So now what we're trying to do is break this down into deliverables that have to be provided for this project. We also talk about in several of our whiteboard sessions the concept of socializing. So socializing between all of our team members, meaning trying to collaborate more effectively and get the input of others on our team. So bringing that information back, we begin to determine the dependencies, the critical path, the issues, risk, and resources required for this project. And we also create a timeline. How long is it going to be able to take to get this project done? How long will it take us to get from point A to point B? And then we go about assigning specific resources to produce deliverables, to get tasks done to produce those deliverables. So the result is, by doing these steps, we produce or we come up with our course of action to get from point A to point B. I always like to look for resources. What are some additional resources that I can or you can use for project managers? So we believe strongly in templates, so you don't have to start from scratch. Take something that's repeatable for your type of projects or maybe for your organizations or the specific type of project that you're doing. Also starting with the resource matrix by knowing who is available in your organization for this project, who's been tapped for this project, and any kind of organizational charts to know who are other resources in other organizations or what other organizations are we going to be interacting with. Those also have an input into some other priorities that may be going on with your project. And number 3, we believe in project management software with document sharing, so that in order to get these planning steps done, we are going to have to, as a project manager, collaborate with other team members, where they're project team members, our change control board, our stakeholders. So these are 5 steps that we believe that are effective in planning your project.
Let's talk about a work breakdown structure. A work breakdown structure is a deliverable-oriented, that's important, deliverable-oriented grouping of work involved in a project that defines the total scope of the project. If it's not in the work breakdown structure, it does not get done. So, how do we create a breakdown structure? First of all, a work breakdown structure is, as we defined it, a deliverable-oriented grouping of the work involved in the project that defines the total scope of the project. If it's not in the work breakdown structure, it is not in the scope. Everything in the scope should be covered by the work breakdown structure. Basically, it's a document that breaks down all the work required into discrete little itty-bitty tasks that group together in a logical hierarchy. It's usually shown in 2 different forms, either a graphical chart or a tabular list. So how do we go about building it? Here are just some examples. You can use the guideline method, the analogy method, the top-down method, the bottom-up method, and the mind mapping method. We're going to talk about these briefly, but basically on page 130 of your book, it shows you these different definitions. First of all, let me tell you, in creating a good WBS, it's difficult. It's difficult because we think we want to get it right the first time. We don't have to get it right the first time. The beauty of this is that you can iterate. You can constantly change and upgrade things. And so as we come across a task that we didn't put in there, we need to make sure we put it in there and plan for it accordingly. The project manager and the project team decide how to group these things and how to put them in the right order. Now, the most important thing is to bring help in when you do this, so that you actually have a committee of people working in each particular area, a committee of experts that knows what they're doing. Usually it's better for the team to focus on the top level stuff and then get the experts involved in the detail. And what you want to do then is make sure that you have 100% agreement. With 100% agreement, what you've got is total buy-in, which is really what you're looking for. One of the things you'll find that really helps you is developing a WBS dictionary. And that's a document that describes how each WBS task is to be done in detail. Once this is done for one project, you'll find yourself drawing upon it as a resource for other projects. So let's talk about making our WBS. How are we going to actually do that? Well, as we take a look at our WBS time management problem, what we see is that this is going to be the tool that we're going to use to ensure the timely completion of the project. It is, in fact, the main tool. We're going to use it for planning, for defining activities, for sequencing them, putting them in order, for estimating their resources, for estimating their durations, and for developing the entire project timeline. How long is it going to last? It's a main management tool. It contains things within it like the milestone list and the project schedule diagram and the network diagram. So let's talk about a milestone list, because I mentioned that word. The milestone list is a list of significant events. Since project management is developed around the deliverables, a milestone is a deliverable usually. It takes several activities to make one usually, and when we complete it, we want to make sure that we mark that as the completion of a task. They usually, the mark itself on the project, it has no cost or duration to a milestone. That's how we really mark that it is. It usually says we've completed the stairway, or we've completed the second floor, something like that. The project sponsors and senior managers often focus on milestones, so we want to make sure we report them and that we're accurate with them. So here's some samples. Oftentimes they appear in a list, and this might be an example of a list. Now, along with the WBS, there's a lot of things that amplify that. In other words, they determine policies and procedures and documentation, because one of the things you have to do is specify exactly what you want. So the project planning, the project schedule management does that. You hold regular meetings, you consult with the experts, you're constantly updating your project. Nobody knows it all. So you're constantly drawing upon information to make sure that your project gets better and better. One of the keys to this is sequencing the activities so that they actually happen in order. So for example, you don't install it before you needed to weld it together. So sequencing the activities and its attributes are part of the statement of work, but it's also part of the determination of the milestone list. It actually sets up the relationship between the tasks. Inherent in that is the dependencies or the relationships. So when does one thing have to happen so the next thing can happen? The correct sequencing has a significant impact on the project itself. So you don't have to go back and undo things that you have done and do them again. One of the other characteristics of the WBS is the duration. How long will it take for things to get done? So for example, time spent working plus elapsed time plus time getting the expert in there, plus maybe there's training time as well. The other thing that you'll have is the effort. How many work days or work hours are required to complete the task? This is really a tough thing to estimate. That's why your experts come in to play. Oftentimes what you'll find is that you have estimates. In other words, we've done something like this 2 years ago, so we at that time took 4 hours, so now we're going to estimate that it's going to take 4 hours again. But duration estimates are often discrete estimates. In other words, they have a specific point of time. Some of them are range estimates, which means they take 3 to 5 weeks or something like that, depending on the expertise or the availability of resources that you have. Most of the time, to compensate for this, we have what is called a 3-point estimate system, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. One of the most important things is when someone comes up and says, how long do you think this is going to take? You should never give out estimates without reviewing them carefully. A milestone is usually defined very carefully, and I want to make sure that you understand what a milestone looks like. A milestone usually follows what is called the SMART criteria. In other words, it's a very specific milestone. It's very measurable. Oftentimes, things like customer satisfaction and things like that have no measure that we're ready to set up, so we have to have them measure. There has to be a metric for it. It has to be achievable within the scope of what we can provide. It has to have a responsible person, someone who is assigned that task, or at least supervising that task. And then it's got to have a time that it's due. So it's going to have a due date. It's going to have a hard line so that we can actually pin down when it's getting done. There's a concept involved in this called a critical path, and that's actually the series of activities that determines how long the project will take. Now, I know this definition says it's the shortest time by which the project can be completed, and that is correct, but the one I find easiest to follow is it's the longest path through the network diagram. So as we do this, that's the one I'm going to keep in mind. Now, one of the nice things about Microsoft Project is it gives you this in the form of what is called a network diagram. So under the Views tab, you can actually see the network diagram. This one's not in color, but you'll notice that the black blocks actually represent the critical path, so that not everything is on the critical path. Not everything is determinative in this particular case. So let's talk about the network diagram. The network diagram itself is the preferred method by project managers of tracking the project. It gives them a lot of information. It's very easy to spot, and relationships are very clear. It's usually a schematic of the logical sequence of things. A program evaluation and review technique, or PERT, is actually part of that network diagram. It's a review of how to analyze and estimate the project duration. So when we take a number of people and sit them down and say, how long do you think this will take? There are going to be a number of variables, and you're going to find out that some have an optimistic time, some have a pessimistic time, and then in the middle is the most likely time. So the example here says that we take the optimistic time, and we add the pessimistic time, and then we multiply 4 times the most likely time to kind of give it more weight, and then we divide by 6. Now, this is another type of chart. This is a Gantt chart, and the Gantt chart is used to illustrate normally to people who don't have a project management background what one looks like. But in this particular case, it's also easy to show the critical path. So as we look at this, it's called critical path analysis, and what we want to do is actually come up with a number. We want to actually know how long the project takes. So the project is a series of activities. We mentioned that. I like the second line definition here. It says, it is the longest path through the network diagram and has the least amount of slack or float. So slack or float are the times when you actually have a delay, or you have a little extra time built in there because something doesn't show up on time or someone is not available at that particular time. But the secret here is it's going to be the longest path. So as we do that, let's take a look at what the critical path really means. The critical path shows the shortest time that the project can be completed. Now, it's actually going to be the longest path through the project. So what that means is if one of the activities on the critical path takes longer than what was anticipated, the whole project has to slip to accommodate that delay. For example, I love this example. The Apple computer team members put a stuffed gorilla on top of the cubicle of whoever was in charge of the critical task so that no one would distract them. So at that point, they had the total focus on what needed to be done. Let's take an example because that's the easiest way to understand critical path analysis. And this is our project system. And the critical path is kind of hidden in this little diagram. And what we want to do is find out how long it takes. So you can see we have event 1, or we have milestone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And the lines represent the duration of the time it takes to create that milestone. So as we go through here, we're going to actually trace to see how far each path is. And my critical mistake in the beginning was to say, well, it's got to go through A, and it looks like E is longer and F is longer, so I would be A, well, see, then I'd get lost. So I would, at that point, kind of lose it. And the idea here is that we want to calculate every single possibility of every single path. So let's do that. Let's start off by doing the A, D, F, H path right along the top. And you'll notice that's the 10 days plus 8 days plus 7 days plus 2 days, or 27 days. Is that the longest one? Well, we don't know without going through each one of the paths. So let's try that. Let's do ADGH, or ADGI. So we're going to do 10 plus 8 plus 4 plus 1 equals 23. Well, that's faster. Okay, that's not going to work. So let's go ahead and do the path where we go through A, then down C, up E, over on F, and H. That's going to take 37 days. That looks like that's the champ so far. That is the longest way through this diagram. Another path might be A, 10 days, C, 6, up E for 12, down G for 4, and I for 1. So at that point, we've got 33 days. So still looks like path 3 is the champ, or the longest one. 5 might be going down the lower path, so we're going to take B for 5, and then E for 12, take F for 7, and H for 2. That ends up with 26. That again is a short one. And the last one would be down both of them, and that would go ahead and be B for 5, E for 12, G for 4, and I for 1. Oh, that's 22. So our champ right now is path 4, or excuse me, path 3, which is going to be the A, C, E, F, H path. That is the longest one, thus that is the critical path. What happens if something is delayed? Well, we want to go ahead and talk about a couple techniques. First of all, you can do what is called crashing. And this makes up for schedule that might be delayed by trading off cost and schedules. So at that point, you might bring in more expertise. and you're going to have to pay for it. You may have a consulting company come in, or you may have to pay for higher quality workmen. But the idea is that you're going to crash it. You're going to take what was originally scheduled and bring in more cost to get the schedule back down. There's also called fast tracking, which is to do activities in parallel that were not normally scheduled to be in parallel, that were actually scheduled to be in sequence, and you're going to put them in parallel. This again adds to the cost. Oftentimes what you're going to find is, rather than just admit the fact that the project is late, these techniques will backfire. And you're going to find out that you're going to run into cost problems, human resource problems, perhaps quality problems, and you still might end up with a longer schedule. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the cost management plan. And the nice thing about cost management plan is this is usually the plan where people are paying a lot of attention, and so you're going to have to report it often. It's the process that is required to ensure that a project team completes the project within the approved budget. Now, we would talk about time, now we're talking about budget. As we do this, basically the time management is the process that we use to track costs. It has to do with estimating costs, determining budgets, and the main documents produce a cost management plan, a cost estimate, and a cost performance baseline. So how do we estimate these costs? Well, we've estimated the duration according to that PERT formula. Let's go ahead and take a look at two methods to estimate the cost. First of all, we have the analogous method, which is actually top-down. And you'll notice that in the paragraph, even though it describes it, there are two key phrases. It's less costly, but it's also less accurate. Here we end up with that plus or minus 10% figure. Bottom up means you start with your experts and work from the WBS back up, and that's going to involve individual activities. It's going to be summing the total project, and it's going to be much more accurate, much more time intensive, and therefore much more expensive to develop. Here's an example of what a cost sheet might look like, or a cost estimate, and I'll just give you a chance to look that over. The most important thing about budgeting cost is to realize that it involves allocating money over the entire estimate time of the project. It is based on the WBS. It's not going to fall outside that. And the main goal is to produce a cost performance baseline or time-phased budget that project managers use to measure and monitor the cost. Don't forget, you can't monitor something that you haven't actually defined.